the 117 units of development is also factored into that. Now, in terms of the county, you provide most of the municipal services or you contract. 117 units of development is also factored into that. Now, in terms of the county, are we good? And make sure yes. Can you read that back and make sure I got that statement correct? Yeah. Because the city provides most of the municipal services either directly or you contract with service agencies or other special districts, et cetera. The county's costs are more on a regional basis and are broken down, as you can see. Health and welfare, conservation and development is one of the line items, in general government. A much larger portion of tax increment we've analyzed as being the portion at Weber County. If a CRA were to be used, that would be the relative amount that the county would put into it. And so you can see those costs over the same time period, about 3.3 million as compared to the city's cost of about 6.8. The last one is depicting the state. The state general government, health and human services, public safety, courts, corrections, education, transportation, and miscellaneous or other. This is basically the general fund budget of the state of Utah. And so by virtue of 117 units and an additional 100, 200 plus employees and all of the other measurables that I mentioned beforehand, the state, we project that the state would have additional costs of servicing the residents and this development of about $53.1 million over that same period. So a lot of costs obviously associated with that, but if you'll recall, they have both the income tax, which is well above 4% of gross taxable income. And also they have sales tax. Yours 1%, but they collect 4.75%. So, magnitude of 4 times more just on sales tax, and also magnitude of income tax, which is significant for this. So, although they have more costs, they have lots more revenue that's actually contributing to this benefit analysis. I did want to mention one other assumption. We did look at this East Area Sewer Lift Station. This is basically a bid tabulation that we were provided by the city to construct the sewer lift station, which our understanding would then provide adequate service for this project area. It would also provide additional development capacity for additional development also within the city. We've estimated, based on this, about a $2.3 million cost. For purposes of the analysis, we increased that to almost $3 million, just so we could capture a little bit of potentially the construction inflation or other costs that might be associated with that. So that was also part of the major assumption made here, that is a cost that's factored into those previous figures, which is really where tax increment is being used. That's where the agency would be used to then fund in part or potentially all of the sewer lift station. So we use $3 million, even though this cost estimate here you can see is $2.2 million. Even with that assumption, adding to the cost, we still feel like there's a net benefit overall fiscally for each of the city, the county, and the state of Utah. I'm going to pause there just for a sec and see if there are any specific questions on tax increment financing. I've got a slide here, but I wanted to make sure if this is redundant or if you've already received some information on this. I won't cover it in too much detail, but what would the council prefer? Would you like me to go through this tax increment in a little more?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So tax increment financing is a public finance tool that is used by municipal entities, local governments, nationally, and also significantly here in Utah, in Weber County, and in cities adjacent to you. And this graph is kind of an illustration of, well, what is tax increment? If you can follow this a little bit, there's a light blue kind of bar at the bottom of this diagram, and that is a base asset value. So in our particular example here for this project, it's potentially greenbelt property taxes, or very limited amount of property taxes that are currently collected off of that project area. But for purposes of tax increment, that base year is established at the time you create it, and everything above that then would be considered what we call incremental tax revenue. That's where tax increment financing comes from. And so if you follow this chart, assessed value is what I mentioned at the very forefront of this. There's an additional $54 million of assessed value. And then the tax rates that the county, the school district, the city, and the other taxing entities impose is what is paid in property taxes. That property tax then gets paid to the county. And then the county, under a creation of a community reinvestment agency, then a portion of that can go to the agency to defray public infrastructure costs, or to provide incentive, or encourage the development of certain types of projects. So we evaluated it and said, okay, the sewer lift station is a offsite and rather large costs associated with this size of a project. So if you were to use tax increment financing, you would create this CRA, and that would define that boundary, which would be coterminous with, the boundary of this development. We would set a base year value, and for all purposes, illustration, that could be zero right now. So all the increment above that would be the $54 million of new value. And then the tax rate that's applied to that is what the dollar amounts would be that could be available to the agency. So in our analysis, for purposes of your fiscal impact, we assume that the 100%, so that's the gray shaded area, would only 75% of what's created of this 54 million would actually come back to the agency for a period of 25 years. And what that would equal is the equivalent of $6 million over the life of that, or using a term net present value, terms of, well, what is the value of 6 million over 25 years? What is it in today's dollar? That would be about 3.9 million. So close to the value of what we think the sewer lift station project might be. And so we conservatively estimated this high. We've used the full 3.9 million, even though the cost estimates were 2.2. And we've used for the full time period to really put on the cost side of this, load it as conservatively as we can. So we felt like that's a fair assumption, given that you may or may not consider a CRA, but if you were to consider it to the full extent, this is the level that potentially could be generated from that. Any questions on tax increment? Yeah.
You mentioned the 75%, and that's kind of the buy-in from each of these entities, correct?
Yeah.
So that's assuming that each of those entities will approve that.
Right.
Because each of them has a yes or no vote based on their board to approve that or disapprove that.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we don't know if they're going, like, especially the school district, for example, it takes a lot for them to approve something like this.
Yeah.
So
absolutely a critical point that you've made. And I think why I wanted to point out that this was a key assumption is it's a conservative assumption from the perspective of, well, is this a benefit to you? We've tried to stretch it to the furthest point of what cost would be. But we also recognize that the CRA may not be approved by other taxing entities. In some cases, it's not property tax that's used. In some cases, there's actually sales tax, incremental sales tax that is used to fund a CRA. For our purposes of fiscal analysis, we didn't necessarily look at specifically the sales tax, but we do recognize there is adequate sales tax that's being generated within the project area. So from the cost benefit side, we've kind of loaded up the costs, but it may be paid a different way, or it may have to be carried by the developer. It may have to be carried by a combination of using this tool or other tools that might help to pay for that. But TIF is a very common tool used in these types of projects. The four other comparable Smith's marketplace projects that we used, each of them had a TIF component, some smaller than others, but they all had some portion of a TIF that was associated with it. And most of it was water or sewer or roads, some public infrastructure element that was funded through it. Okay. So where does that leave us, I guess? Where does that direct us to based on those assumptions, based on the various components of employment, the amount of gross taxable sales that we would anticipate, et cetera? What really is then the net impact? And so we look at this from both the revenue perspective, benefits versus a cost perspective. And so table E1, the first one, is really each of those individual entities and how much revenue is generated over that same time period. Now, the revenue for the city includes a very small property tax portion, sales tax, and municipal energy tax. Those are the revenue sources that the city would have. The county would have property tax, sales tax, and those would be the primary sources for that. Whereas the state of Utah, they don't levy a property tax. They have income tax and sales tax. And so those gross numbers you can see is the 84 million, and that's over that 25-year period. Using a 4% discount rate, that would be the equivalent of, well, what is it? What does that $84 million mean to us in terms of today's dollar value? That's the 47.4 million. Then you can see the impact side of it is in E2, the table below, which is the cost of services and the tax increment. So recall from an earlier slide, we estimated that Hooper's overall cost to provide services was going to be 6.8 million. That's reflected there. Weber County's about 3.3, and then the state of Utah 53.1. And then you have a corresponding net present value table as well. So what's the net impact? That's where the very top chart, if you will, points out that the net benefit over costs, after you take into account all of those things, cost of this sewer lift station, the cost of providing public safety, public works, et cetera, is still a net benefit of $21.5 million over that time period. And then it's broken out down below for each of those entities. Hooper City specifically, your revenues, I mentioned property tax, sales tax, energy tax. Your expenses are the tax increment, public safety, public works, general government, parks and recreation. And the net fiscal benefit in this case is 7.7 million. Weber County is much smaller, as I mentioned before, but they provide a lot less in terms of services to that project area or to the residential population. In their case, it's a net fiscal benefit of 1.9 million. And then the state is 11.9 million. That makes up that's how we get to the total of the 21.5 million. So more than half of the fiscal benefit comes to the state of Utah. However, a good portion, as you'll recall, does flow through to the city of Hooper in this case. And that's 7.7 million, not to the same extent that the state benefits, but certainly more in this case than the county benefits. So let me just pause one more time and maybe some conclusions, and then open it up to some additional questions or comments. But we were asked specifically, and these are the two questions that are really addressed in here. We were asked first and foremost, does this project make sense for the city to consider from a fiscal perspective? And our conclusion was that yes, the proposed Smith's Marketplace, the mixed use, retail, and also the residential components of this, based on just the fiscal net benefit that's created for the city and the other taxing entities, yes, it proves to be economically viable, financially viable. And if that's the only lens that you're looking through, then it would make sense to consider a zone change here and to do this project. The second element that we noted is the creation of a community reinvestment area. So a project area for tax increment financing. We believe that there is some extraordinary costs, offsite costs relative to the sewer lift station. Whether or not the CRA would be used to cover the full amount or just a part of it, it was not purviewed, if you will, under our analysis, but it was purviewed from the overall cost and the capital markets in terms of, in addition to the $50+ million that would have to be constructed, financed, and developed, you'd have this additional offsite cost of $3 million, which would have an impact on the capital, structure. So we did determine that tax increment made sense to look at. And even though it's included, even that didn't tip the scales to suggest that this was not a fiscal benefit, overall benefit to the city. And so that's our conclusion. There's volumes of information, I think, that's in the report itself. But now I'll turn it back to you, Mayor, and see if there's any additional questions that I could respond to.
Thank you. Council, do you have questions you would like to ask Mr. Birmingham?
I have one question, and you probably weren't able to extract this information, but were you able to, like that lift station, it's a $2-3 million component. What's the longevity of it? Were you able to assess the maintenance cost on that? Is that built into here, or is that something that is just a question mark?
No, it's we do have a footnote. The way we looked at that particular improvement is we didn't look at it as a general fund cost item. We did look at it as a utility, meaning that you would most likely be paying for that out of your utility fees. So yes, there is an operation component of that. And we did determine that that would be built into your user fees. And we would think that, it would have some bearing on what the user rates would be through the community, but not specific to how much of a rate increase, if any, would be suggested. But we do anticipate that there would be operational costs associated with that, and ratepayers would be the primary source to repay that.
So I have a question. Ultimately, on a TIF or a CRA, who ends up paying that back?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of questions maybe unbundled in that. I think in terms of initially who pays the property tax, I think would be a good place to start. What we're talking about in tax increment financing is taxes that are going to be paid anyway. So this isn't a new tax. It isn't like this project area has an additional tax rate in addition to the tax rate they already have. It would just be part and parcel to what your certified tax rate is, meaning the cities, the counties, the school district. And so it's really more of a diversion of those tax revenues as opposed to new revenues. So who pays those? Well, it would be the residents. It would be the 117 units would pay a portion of that. It would also be the 165,000 square feet of retail, but it would not be outside of that project area. So if that's the question of, well, who pays for the benefit of those sewer improvements? In the case of a tax increment district, it's really just those 46 acres that would be paying that. Now, you can create separate agreements. Potentially, you would even consider with the developer a reimbursement agreement or some type of a pioneering agreement where the developer would pay it all up front. And then if there are other beneficiaries that benefit from it after, they would pay a fee that then could defray both the cost of the tax increment or the cost, to the developer. And that's very common to do. But if the question was, we're concerned of, does the rest of the residents have to pay for that infrastructure to support this project? The TIF is a mechanism to not do that. The TIF is very specific to doing it on the development that's created that would be paying for the improvement. The second part of that question, which I'm inferring from her question, might be whose tax revenue is that? And in the case of tax increment, what our assumptions, and I think Mr. Hill made a point of this, is that the city is a very, very small fraction of the overall property tax that's collected. Really, the biggest portion is going to be the school district. Then next is going to be the county, and then you have fire districts and other districts. So the revenue, although paid by the development, paid by property owners and the commercial development, when it goes to the CRA, that passes through from the other taxing entities. And the biggest portion of that would come from the school district. So hopefully I adequately answered that question.
I have two questions. The state legislature has toyed with the idea of taking away sales tax on food. We know this is a grocery store going in. That's where a lot of the sales tax is generated from, is sale of groceries. From my understanding, there's two components to the sales tax. There's a local option and the state option. If the state opts to do away with their portion of the sales tax on food, would that directly affect the state revenues only, or does that have an effect on local revenue?
It would just impact the state revenues, and most of the dialogue right now in terms of removing it from food is on the state level. There's some additional issues that are somewhat difficult. I won't go into all the difficulties relative to removing sales tax from food, but local government, municipal government, use the issuance of sales tax revenue bonds to support a lot of their infrastructure costs, whereas the state of Utah uses general obligation bonds. Basically, they're authorized by the legislature to a certain amount. Although they don't levy a property tax, they can use any general fund revenues to pay those bonds back, but they don't specifically pledge sales tax. So in their case, removing it from the state level, they don't impair bondholders, if that makes sense. So the state can kind of do what they want relative to the sales tax because it's not a pledged collateral. Cities, however, of the 240 some odd cities, there's at least probably 50% of those cities that have sales tax revenue bonds in place that protect bondholders, and it's a pledge of the sales tax. And a big component of that is food. And so if the state were to remove that, there's also a clause that the state would have to, non-impairment is what the clause is called. So they couldn't impair your ability. So they'd have to make it up somehow else. They'd have to either raise the 1% to a new level so that you would have revenue neutral. So it's not on food, or they'd have to come up with another mechanism to hold bondholders harmless. That's the non-impairment issue. But what's talked about mostly is the state's portion. Yeah.
My other question was this last page, Appendix B, that talks about the net present value analysis. Could you explain that to us? Because I know looking at the numbers here, Over the 25-year period, it gives Hooper City a net inflow of $4.3 million compared to this 21.5 we're talking about over here for the fiscal analysis. Can you
Yeah.
explain the difference on that?
Certainly. That's an important clarification as well. I think in each of the models, and I think for the benefit of those that are watching as well, let me just focus on Hooper specifically, but it relates to what your question is. All of our tables and all of the analysis that you'll see in your packet does include what we call a net present value analysis. And you can see there's two columns here, total, which I would say is future value, meaning that's the total amount of revenues and expenses over that 25-year period. And then what net present value analysis is intended to do is to try to put it back in today's dollars, meaning if I gave you $14 million today, that would be worth $14 million to you today, correct? But if I gave you 14 million, but I spanned that over 25 years and I give you $1 million here and $1 million there, and over that 25 years, that 14 million doesn't have the buying power of 14 million. In our case, it would only have the buying power of 8 million. It's a method, if you will, to bring it back to today's terms so that you don't have these overly inflated numbers that you say, well, that's hard for us to get our arms kind of around that. That's where we use the net present value to say, in today's terms, it's really, although it's 7.7 million over 25 years, it's really the equivalent of only about 4.3 million if we discounted it at 4%. And the same applies to this 21.5 million is really only 11.8 million. So
that's, in lack of a better term, that's the reality number.
yeah, to me, that's
the inflation number.
That's really taking the idea of inflation out of it and trying to bring everything in today's costs and say, you know, if I have to wait 25 years to get 21 million, is that really worth it to me? So we try to put it in the context of, well, no, it's really the equivalent of you are getting, you know, 7.7 million, but it really only has buying power to you of about 4.3 million. And the same for the, you know, the county and the state. So it's a better reflection in my mind of, well, what is reality? Is this really something we want to pursue? Because you could, in some of these cases, you could be back end loaded, meaning all of your revenue could be deferred out long. Let's say that you use tax increment and included sales tax, municipal energy tax, and all of that was diverted up front, but you also have the costs up front, but then your revenues deferred out long. You might have the same total value of numbers in terms of revenue and expense, but when you put that through the net present value, it might be a negative. So that's why we try to look at it over that spectrum of time and trying to put it back into today's dollars. And so that's really a common method for fiscal and economic impact, but I think that's a good way to describe it. Okay, that's the reality of, is this a positive or is this going to drain us?
I have one more question. Council member Maragoni and I'm on Zoom. So Weber County in our last meeting last August said that because we have such a small portion of property tax, that probably initially we would have to put the sales tax towards the CRA if we went that way. Is this still a possibility?
It is. And council member, you probably can't see the screen.
I can't.
Okay. I'm pointing to a slide that is specific to Hooper and the $7.7 million positive net fiscal impact.
Uh-huh.
And I was just going to illustrate that's a significant number, even if to the point I think she's making is there may not be property tax participation, or it may be a lot lower, which means maybe what would be asked of the city is to put some of its sales tax as a portion of trying to get this contribution or get the infrastructure financed. My comment would be that there's a fairly significant gap, so that if you did defer a little bit of sales tax, you would still have a net positive. And I haven't tried to suggest negotiating, with the county or the school district, but I think that's the point that would be made, is you do get a fair amount of sales tax here. It pointed out, the risk of sales tax is, well, what if you remove it from food?
Right.
All of those risk components are here, but the fact that it's 7.7 million over the life of that suggests to me that you have some wiggle room potentially to use sales tax. And to answer your question, yes, it can be included in a CRA, and you can use both. The city could use one source, the county could use another source, the school district could use another source, all of which is negotiable. Different percentages, length of time, all of those things could be negotiated. And what we would recommend, obviously, is that we really narrow in on the cost of this improvement. Then we also determine if there are other ways in which to pay for it, i.e. impact fees, future impact fees, et cetera, that might come back. And then you'd structure the CRA around what revenue do you need from there. But if sales tax were to be used, it would change the 7.7 million down. But I think there's adequate capacity to still consider that and have a net benefit here.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Are there any other questions from the council?
Oh,
Okay.
I do have one more. I'm sorry, because I'm not real good with numbers and that. So, and what would the city expect over each year? Because I can't see the numbers. What would the city be able to expect each year as a net over the 25-year period?
Yeah, Malcolm, would you be able to pull up the spreadsheet?
And I
Yes,
actually just did a quick
Oh, okay.
calculation. If you take 7.7 million, you divide that by the 25 years, it comes to 308,000 a year.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the 4.3, but
yeah,
our thought
So-
was is it also grows.
it also grows.
So
So if it stayed at only that,
Yeah.
it would be that, but it could grow as well.
right.
Okay, so around 300,000 a year.
Yeah, I would say it's more around probably 150,000 to begin with, and it might grow up to 450,000. And then when you take into account the net present value of that, it would be deducted accordingly. Obviously, closer you are to the period of time we are, the less discount that you would take from that cash flow.
Okay, thank you.
That was a question I had as well. And we had talked about this as staff. It was on page 39 and it talks about net cash flows and it starts in 2025. And I don't know if that sheet will show up there or not. And I could be
Yeah.
reading this incorrectly, but it looked to me like in 2025, when it comes to net cash flows, the city is actually in the negative by 10,000. Am I reading that right?
Yep, exactly right.
So we're in the negative. The city is in 2025 of 10,384. And in 2026, the city goes to a negative of 33,644. In 2027, we're in a negative of 56,909. And then once the Smiths is completed, if we go that direction, then you start to see the net positive. But prior to that, we are in the negative.
Very astute. That's exactly right. And as I'd point out, I know it's hard to visualize this, but what you just talked about is exactly right. What we would anticipate is costs probably before the revenues. So during the construction phase of Smiths itself, there will be some benefit in terms of the jobs created during construction, sales tax that would be spent in the community and so forth. But property tax is not a main generator for you, but it is for other taxing entities. And so that's really in arrears, if you will. The costs come before you get property taxes. Sales tax would catch up when you actually get in the ground and so forth. So I should mention that there are assumptions made in terms of absorption. So the residential, by virtue of what the developer gave us in terms of their time frame of building the 117 units, and we did look at the market relative to that and whether or not they thought they could absorb it within the 4 or 5 years. And we determined, yes, there is a market for that. We are within a housing shortage, and the price points that they're talking about would be absorbed. But it is front end loaded more with residential. You get the Smiths kind of with that same time frame, and then the retail kind of comes as you get a little more mature in terms of that overall retail marketplace. And so you're absolutely right. That's why I was trying to say there's, overall net present value, net benefit, fiscal benefit. Early on, if some of those other uses aren't built and don't come to, don't come, then there is potentially a gap relative to the cost of the residential units. And maybe the easiest way to describe it is commercial pays probably more than its share, and residential typically pays a little less than what the cost of services. And so we balance that with building a tax base around office and retail and et cetera. And that's, an issue that all communities face at some point of, can you just make fiscal budgets work just on residential? And it's difficult without a tax base, even more so without a property tax or a higher property tax. And so one of the reasons we looked at this and evaluated it and said this is kind of ideal is, one, your general plan is very much in stride with this, meaning it's said that selective locations and corridors, we need retail, not only for the benefit and welfare of our residents, but we need economic tax base. We need the ability to continue to provide services to residents. And that really is the case here. So caution, if I could, is always residential projects up front that don't materialize into commercial can be a risk to the city and the community. Where you can, my guess is the Smiths will be locked up at the same time that the residential is, but the other retail could take a little bit of time to absorb based on the market.
I know that you had mentioned you'd compared other tax increment financing with the other local Smiths. Was there any comparison as far as the net income to those cities? So as far as other, Smiths or even other grocery stores, as far as their impact on cities with it having the impact?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Probably not specifically analyzed. I can tell you anecdotal that each of them that I did mention had tax increment financing as part of it. I don't recall that any of them had $3 million necessarily of tax increment that was used for public infrastructure. They were more in the lines of $1.5 million, $2 million, something along those lines.
Any other questions? Let me ask council, this is not a public hearing. Yeah, so we're really not opening it up to questions at this time. So any other questions?
I think we should mention that they should feel free to contact their council member with any questions they have.
That they're asking, we are having a planning commission meeting, but we originally hadn't said that you're coming back to the planning commission meeting. We've already had a public hearing, like we did mentioned in our work meeting on this. So it maybe.
I'm happy to consider another time if there's a venue that you'd like to consider in terms of addressing, community questions, et cetera. I know that wasn't, we kind of went back and forth on, how this would look, but I'm certainly willing and able to make myself available if that's a desired path to go.
Okay. So yeah, we can discuss that and get back
Okay.
with you. So, okay. Any other questions from City Council that you have? Okay, thank you. We appreciate your time. And this study was in the packet. And so for all of you residents that maybe some of this is the first time that you've seen it, go to hoopercity.com. If you go into government, under agendas, you go to tonight's agenda, you will see the packet. And it is, I believe, 42 pages, I think, long, somewhere in there, but it gives you a lot of good information. And I appreciate your explanations. I've gone through and made some questions, but I feel like you gave us those answers. So thank you. Okay, the next thing we have on our agenda then is a discussion and then possibly a motion from Roy City. Is there someone here from Roy City that is come to do that presentation? Okay, we'll turn the time over to you. Thank you. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the time that you guys will take to listen to us. We're with Advanced Homes, for the developer for Park 43 that is located wholly in Roy City. Oh, yeah, and Pete Smith. Don't touch the mic. We've developed the townhomes on 4300 West in Roy City. Part of that development includes an open space on the west side of the slough. As you can see, it is currently zoned through Roy City as single family homes. So it's approved for the single family homes to be on the west side of the slough, given access. What we've looked at is some challenges with the slough. Obviously comes down to utility access. And so what we have in our review of the site have seen that the closest connections are in Hooper City. So really what our request is access to Hooper City sewer and water for those 3 single family homes. All of the water connections, the plan would be to stay within Hooper City along the curb line so that any of your employees wouldn't have to cross those lines to get to those and have long services to those. And then the sewer would be installed in a public utility easement down the private lane. It's a fairly simple request. It's something, one of our first requests looking at it in terms of close access. To us, we would see that as a benefit to Hooper City and providing additional services, utilizing the space in a way that's amenable to what has been discussed. We came into this project after, we're not the original planner developer on it. We came in and took over the project from the previous developer after it had been annexed into Roy City and through most of the planning portion of that. And so we have just seen the property there. We have a large amount of open space. Part of Roy's requirement is that we have to maintain a 25% minimum open usable space in the overall development. And so that's how we're looking to try and incorporate that and maintain the open space. Part of that development also has extended the trail system that comes through the Hooper City property adjacent to the north of our development and continues it down through so that it could be continued over to 5500 South and connect to the other trail systems as well. And so that's our simple. We've talked with some of your utility offices and they had recommended we come to you to present and seek your approval up front on that connection process. Part of that is that Roy wants it. We've provided a couple of pictures and renderings of what we intend to build. This is from a project we constructed in Kaysville City. These are actually duplexes, but for the zoning of it, they're about 3,000 square feet, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. What we have seen, and so we provided some floor plans for that. Just to give you a rough idea of what we intend, they have limited footprints to maintain setbacks and the open space requirements. Part of what we looked at with this is that it doesn't provide any additional impact to that circle other than would be in a normal construction environment. We've tried to keep that number down to where if you looked at that circle, there's space based on the lot sizes there that would accommodate 3 additional houses on that circle. So trying to minimize our impact overall. In a nutshell, that's kind of what we're looking for. So are there any questions you have for us related to that utility access?
Just looking at that property off of 55 South, going to the north, there's a piece of land there, and then there's a vinyl fence, and then another piece of property before the roundabout going north.
On the circle, I guess. Just
yeah. So the circle.
So here.
So the circle, yeah, and then coming to the south. It seems like there's a piece of property and there's a vinyl fence.
The vinyl fence here.
Is it right there?
So this is our vinyl fence that we put up.
Okay.
For the development. We also fence the backside as well. If you look at that, perfect. Thank you. If you look at this, will be easier. Okay. If you look at this area here, this is where the existing gate is in the property, the existing drive that's been there for quite some time. It doesn't show well on this plan just because of the size of it overall for planning purposes, but the sidewalk and a portion of the park strip actually do cross the property line now and exist on an easement that's in place. And so we do directly abut to that. Obviously, you would have some vehicular traffic that would come into that space. We're not looking to modify that roadway whatsoever. Realistically, what we would see, we need the permit process through Hooper City for that sewer connection and the water connections to be able to set those meters. And then an agreement with the city in order to provide those services to those homeowners on a long-term basis. All of the garbage and plowing for that development are handled within the HOA that handles the rest of the development. And so those services would continue to be provided by the HOA.
One question that I have, as far as impact fees, will those be paid to Roy because this is Roy?
So obviously we would have a portion that would be paid to Roy, but I would assume that there would be some connection fee associated with our connection to Hooper Sewer, as well as providing a public utility easement for that sewer to feed down that private lane in order to connect to the individual houses.
Because that was one question I had. Of course, the sewer fees would be paid to Hooper City because it's our city. But additional to that, the taxes would be paid to Roy.
That's correct.
And so if there was any additional expense to Hooper City, Hooper would really not be getting any of that because that would go to Roy they would be paying their taxes to Roy.
They would. The impact there truly is just the utilities and that road access to it. So you have a circle that's there already that the existing homeowners utilize. It's part of why we looked at our density on that and not adding more units there. Twofold, I know that the multifamily being that far back was an issue in the initial process of the development, which is why Roy came back and approved it as single family only on the west side of the slough.
I know with some other properties along 4300, we've had that property along 4300 is interesting between Roy and Hooper. You do have some properties that are on the west side of the road that are Roy, and we also have some properties on the east side of the road that are Hooper properties.
There are.
And in the past, when residents that were in the Hooper residents, but have wanted to get sewer because there's not sewer if you extend further north on 4300, they have been told by Roy they would have to annex into Roy in order to be able to hook into that sewer. So I guess my question is then, I don't mean to sound like a greedy mayor, but I always look at what is the benefit to Hooper. No. If we're going to agree to something for Hooper and we are being stewards over Hooper, then what would be the benefit to Hooper to have us do this? Because I think if it was on the other side, Roy would probably require it to be annexed. And I'm not saying that Hooper necessarily would want you to annex, but is that a possibility of you, if that was something you would annex
It's
into?
definitely something we
Hooper?
consider. Obviously, this is kind of our first steps in it, in what has already been planned and approved. We have entertained other options for this that create complications and struggles for that. And so obviously our initial is to come to you and ask for that connection fee. To us, we'd assume that you would be making, that you have some margin in your services you're providing to those, however minimal, and those would continue to be paid by those residents directly to Hooper. So that would be part of that agreement, would be a shared utility agreement that would allow you to bill those homeowners and whatever connection fees that come with that as those change over, as well as whatever the permitting fees would be related to setting up those utilities on your system.
I agree with the mayor. I mean, I always think, what's the long-term benefit to Hooper City? And, you know, like, aside from the sewer monthly fee that we get, I don't see any other benefit. So my recommendation would be to ask Roy City about annexation as well.
Okay.
Because that's the game they play with us.
Understand.
So,
No, we understand. It's an interesting piece of property from the beginning.
mhm.
It technically all has a Hooper City zip code. It's all serviced by Hooper post office. What I get for touching it. No, that's ultimately the presentation. And so if that's the recommendation that we came to present based on recommendation from your staff to come and present it to you as an initial step. And so that's really what we're looking for, is for what you're looking for us to do to accommodate this.
So what questions, City Council, do you have? This on our agenda is a discussion and a motion. So are there questions that you have for him?
I'd just like to say that I agree with Ryan as far as what he said, and that's the path that I'd follow.
If there's no other discussion, is there someone on the council then that would like to make a motion concerning this? Yeah, that.
I don't know that necessarily needs a motion. To me, it was
Okay.
a discussion point. What we were told
Okay.
to come for a discussion to address it and see what you needed to have happen. So I think
And then
that ended
maybe
up on
that
the
could be
agenda.
something that you would go back. There are some criteria with this. Hooper doesn't currently allow private roads, and the width of your road does not fit in with our ordinance. So
Understand.
there would be if this is agreed to annex into Hooper, there's going to have to be some modifications done with this plan.
Understand. I think things to remember there as we look at this is that part of this would lock that property up for further expansion to the south. It would lock in that circle as it is. The current easement has some adjustments to it that would potentially have impacts that continue. The property to the south is in Roy as well, where the gas station is, as well as the piece to the west of it. And so obviously we looked at our initial steps on how to make this work, and we appreciate your input. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next on our agenda then are citizen comments. This can be anyone that would like to come up, and you are allotted 3 minutes. And if you will come up and state your name, and this is for something that is not on the agenda.
All right. Would you mind giving them these? It's just the previous agendas. Sure, you can all guess what I'm here to talk about.
Will you
again.
state your name, please, sir?
Jake Kelso,
Thank you.
resident. I'd like to once again ask that citizen comment be restored to the agenda. Sherry took it upon herself to remove the agenda, removing an item that was added after discussion by the council. Thank you. Sherry would not remove or block items added by the council if she had any respect for the council. Sherry has shown complete disrespect to the council by removing and blocking agenda items. She's shown a complete lack of willingness and transparency, or for transparency and open dialogue with Hooper residents by preventing citizen comment before agenda items are motioned on. Citizen comment was added to the beginning of the agenda, February 6, 2020, with the note that you could only discuss agenda items, which is completely reasonable. They also kept citizen comment at the end. Later wording was added that you could not discuss agenda items at the end, which again is completely reasonable because you already had an opportunity to discuss agenda items prior to the motions. I'm again asking that citizen comment be restored to the beginning of the agenda. I would also like to suggest that the council creates an ordinance that would prevent the mayor from removing or blocking agenda items added by the council. And I had some things from the packet that I read, because I did read the packet, that I wanted to discuss, but I still can't.
Okay, thank you. And as we've addressed, I believe in 2 meetings already as recommendations from our attorney, if we allow citizen comments at the beginning of the meeting, every meeting becomes a public hearing. We follow the same, excuse me, sir, you are allowed to talk. Well, yeah, yes, that is what our attorney has recommended. And we follow the same as Planning Commission. If you look at the Planning Commission agendas, they also have that at the end. So is there any other citizen comments?
I have a comment as a council member, if I may quickly. What can we do to allow citizens participate in discussion about the agenda so that they feel that they have a say?
And an answer, because I've thought about that as well. I was one, as I said at the beginning, I had citizen comments at the beginning and was given the recommendation that then it does create everyone. All of us up here were elected by you. And what we want you to do is to reach out to your city council members. To myself, I am a member of the city council. I just serve as mayor and chairman. Reach out to us and give us your opinions of how you would like us to represent you. And the same with your planning commission members. Reach out to them and let them know how you would like to be represented. So, okay, go ahead.
Amber Kelso. For over 3 years, I've followed closely what has been going on in our city, and it breaks my heart to see what is being allowed to happen. I want to speak out in defense of my sister, Amanda Prince, who has served on the Planning Commission with dedication for several years now. She is well known for being well-spoken, for doing countless hours of research, and for standing for truth and ethical practice. She loves Hooper and believes in the citizens' rights and has fought to protect them. Those who've been following know that my sister has been an advocate and asset for the citizens of Hooper, and the only people who would endeavor to silence her are those who seek unethical personal gain or who are consumed with vengeance, that so much so that no moral compass remains. What is being allowed to happen to Amanda right now is no short of criminal, and yet ironically, the justice system is being weaponized against her. I believe this is a clear, orchestrated attempt to control and silence those who may not agree with the mayor's agenda. To have Mayor Bingham deciding anything regarding this situation is 100% a conflict of interest. It is my belief that we have someone in our city government who is using their position of power to deliberately target other public officials who do not agree with them or whom they have a personal vendetta against. There is no limit to how low this individual and their family will stoop or how dishonest they will be. The constant harassment and bullying of the council and commission is unreal, and honestly, I don't know how many in this room sleep at night. I wonder how much of the taxpayers' money, resources, and time has and will be spent chasing Mayor Bingham's enemies. Our mayor says often that she is concerned about taxpayer dollars, yet I wonder how many taxpayer dollars have been squandered by utilizing our attorney and other resources for her personal agendas. This is something every citizen should be striving to look into. To the Hooper residents who are listening or who may listen in the future, I want it to be known on the record that we have a mayor who is unwilling to listen to the voice of the people. She has taken public comment off of the agenda. She has run interference with the Planning Commission trying to set up meetings with public comment and surveys regarding upcoming development. I believe that is one reason that the council is attempting to ensure the rights of the commission to be able to do their job. She is not transparent, which is evidenced by the closed door meeting she conducted with the developer over the Smiths project, asking council members to come where they were asked to give their commitment outside of the public eye. Our mayor will stop at nothing to go after her perceived opponents, and I do mean nothing, and that includes a willingness to abuse her power. It's despicable, and Hooper citizens should be outraged. What I stand here today and say can be verified if you are willing to look into it and ask. I would encourage all to do so. Regardless of what direction you think Hooper should go, things in our government should be carried out with transparency and ethically. I had a good mom growing up. She taught me to always stand up and speak out for the right, and that's how I find myself standing here today. I hope others will stand too.
Thank you. Is there any other public comments?
My name is Chantel Murrah. Most of you city council members would think I don't have a right to talk because my mom was elected as mayor. I didn't run for mayor, but I expect to be protected as a citizen. We had a city planning commission member who physically assaulted a member of our community. And because it is a relative of the mayor, you don't care. So I'm not safe in this meeting. Any one of you could physically assault me and it does not matter. Does that extend to my children? Does it extend to your children? Because a family member chooses to run, their family members should not be able to be attacked. And you don't even allow for the time for an investigation. It was serious enough that the Royce City Police recommended it to go to the prosecutor. It wasn't dropped by the police. It was recommended to the prosecutor. And you don't even allow time. It is not fair to the victim. It is not fair to the rest of Hooper City. If you have a planning commission member who cannot hold her temper when confronted by a public member, that isn't okay. And it shouldn't matter what relation that is to the mayor. It shouldn't. We do have a big problem in the city. And most of what Amber has addressed about going after enemies is what she is doing and what the people that fight for her are doing. But somewhere there needs to be some semblance of order in the city, and somewhere there is protected. So if there is a time to allow for investigation, city council should not be bullying through that. It is not fair. I don't usually come to city council, but I don't feel safe. Councilman Maragoni says she doesn't feel safe, but she's never been physically assaulted. Something needs to stop.
Just hold on. I did get word from the city prosecutor in Troy during the meeting today.
Okay. We're gonna stop. We don't do that. Thank you. Is there any other public comment?
Yeah, I got it. Blake Severing, resident of Hooper. So with the recent storms, I've noticed as I drove through the city that there's quite a few vehicles, trailers and such on the side of the road. And it come to my attention that either I missed the memo or I didn't know we had a trailer lot right here by the pickleball court. So I'm wondering, can anybody park their trailers there to get them off the road or get them out of their driveway? What's the rule, or what has the council decided with that trailer lot that's east of the pickleball courts? Just wondering, because I got plenty of trailers. I would love to get out of off the side of the road, and I know my neighbor's got 3 or 4 as well. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. We will look into that. Are there any other public comments? Okay, seeing no other public comments, can we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, we are going to ask, based on things that have happened in the past, if all residents would please leave the Hooper City property, and after everyone has left, then the city